2 years prior, a man had lost all he held dear, and somewhere on the desolate, unfeeling streets, his closest companion had as well. Today, beneath a turbulent sky, a weather-beaten German shepherd establishes eye contact with an unfamiliar individual. And in that fleeting moment, the world seems to pause. What transpires next is a narrative of devotion, endurance, and a connection that time could not sever. Remain with us, for some reunions do more than mend the heart. They reshape it. Ethan Cole once experienced a life that, while not newsworthy, enriched him quietly in all significant aspects. A time-worn mechanic's workshop nestled in the core of Colorado, a devoted spouse named Sarah, and a German shepherd puppy called Max who rarely let Ethan stray from his view. It was not a life of luxury, but it was dependable, until the evening the world was abruptly pulled from under his feet. A careless motorist, a sudden glare of headlamps, a life shattered in an instant. Sarah was no more. No forewarning, no farewell, only a sterile hospital and a man left gripping a leash with no one at its other end. Sorrow has a way of hollowing one out so thoroughly that one forgets the essence of being human. Ethan ceased attending work. Unpaid bills accumulated like fallen autumn foliage. And soon, the house that once carried the aroma of fresh coffee and motor oil became an empty mausoleum he could no longer maintain. Throughout it all, Max remained. Initially, a steadfast heartbeat nestled against Ethan's legs during the interminable nights when he could not summon the will to move from the floor. But depression does not merely isolate. It inflicts punishment. The day Ethan packed his meager remaining possessions into a dilapidated truck, Max became agitated. Unfamiliar individuals with loud voices and impatient demeanor attempted to assist with the loading. In the ensuing confusion, Max slipped his collar and fled into the woods behind the property. Ethan searched for hours, calling his name into the dense trees, but the forest absorbed the echoes completely. Perhaps it was the overwhelming guilt. Perhaps it was the profound, persistent conviction that he did not merit finding him. Regardless, Ethan departed from the town that night without Max, driving into a future as barren as the passenger seat beside him. 2 years later, the allure of the past proved too potent to ignore. Ethan found himself driving back into the town he had vowed never to revisit. The shops were unchanged, the streets familiar yet alien. The garage he once owned now bore new signage, a fresh layer of paint, feigning ignorance of the man's unraveling it had witnessed. Ethan parked down the street, stepped out into the brisk afternoon air, and stood there, inhaling 100 memories that struck with greater force than any winter tempest. What he did not know, what he could not have known, was that he was not the sole individual drawn back to these streets. Somewhere beyond the brick alleyways and rusted fences, a battered German shepherd caught a scent on the wind that made his ears perk up and his legs tremble. A scent he hadn't smelled in what felt like 1,000 lifetimes. Max had survived everything the streets had thrown at him, clinging to the one memory that kept him alive. The face of the man who once knelt down, held out a hand, and promised, "You and me, buddy. Always." Sometimes the past doesn't stay buried. Sometimes it waits patiently, battered but breathing, for the right moment to find its way home. And just like that, two broken souls unknowingly stepped onto the same path once more, under the same wide sky they used to share. If towns possessed the ability to speak, this one would murmur tales of shadows, of a spectral figure that materialized and vanished in alleyways, seldom observed, yet never forgotten. They referred to him as the ghost dog. No collar, no owner, merely a battered German shepherd whose ribs were visible through matted fur, its eyes too weary for a creature so young. He did not solicit food. He did not bark. He simply searched, perpetually searched, as if pursuing something the world insisted no longer existed. Yet, every paw print declared otherwise. He still believed. Max had acclimated to street existence with a harsh sort of elegance. Winters were the most challenging. Blizzards transformed sidewalks into frozen battlegrounds, and sustenance became less a matter of survival and more a matter of improbable fortune. He learned the locations where diner proprietors discarded leftovers after business hours, where the elderly widow left a container of food on her doorstep every Thursday. But regardless of the cruelty of the days or the length of the nights, Max invariably returned to a single location, the derelict shell of Ethan's former garage. He would remain there for hours, his tail thumping feebly against the fractured asphalt, gazing at the front entrance as if willing it to open. Local residents occasionally caught sight of him, a grizzled old shepherd limping along the railway lines, a phantom weaving among the broken fences at twilight. Some avowed he was a portent. Others left out bowls of water, too apprehensive or too awestruck to approach. And Max, he remained an enigma wrapped in scars and silence, following a map etched into his memory, a map that consistently led back to Ethan. Meanwhile, Ethan was not faring much better. His return to town had stirred a concoction of guilt, sorrow, and a glimmer of hope he dared not acknowledge aloud. He traversed streets that once felt like home but now resembled pages torn from a book he could not complete. Every corner turned, every rusted sign passed, carried the sharp sting of recollection. A dog barking in the distance caused his chest to constrict. A flash of tan fur from the corner of his eye made him pivot sharply, only to find an empty space. Fate possesses a dark sense of humor at times. Max and Ethan roamed the same streets, breathed the same dusty air, separated by mere blocks yet by chasms of lost time. One evening, just as the rain began to smudge the town's colors into a hazy watercolor, Max detected something, a scent that pierced the fog of his mind like a bolt of lightning. He froze, ears forward, nose twitching. It was faint, but it was there, familiar, impossible. Simultaneously, across the town square, Ethan leaned against a lamppost, allowing the cold rain to soak into his jacket. For the first time in 2 years, he felt something stir deep in his gut, a presence like being watched, not with fear, but with recognition. The rain intensified, turning streets into rivers. People rushed for shelter, but Max stayed rooted to the spot, his eyes locked on a figure blurred by mist and distance. Was it real? Could it be? Doubt and hope wrestled inside him, each heartbeat heavier than the last. This wasn't just another night, this was something different, something electric, alive, pulling two broken halves back together across a storm. They didn't know it yet, but destiny was already rewriting its script. The rain fell as if the heavens themselves were in mourning. Streets glistened beneath flickering streetlights, and puddles reflected fragmented images of the world above. Ethan stood motionless at the square's periphery, his jacket saturated, water dripping from his hair. Across the inundated street, through a haze of mist and disbelief, a figure stared back at him. A dog, no, not merely any dog. A German shepherd with a body weathered by survival and a spirit that refused to be broken. Max. For a heartbeat, neither moved. The world around them dissolved into nothing but the space between two souls who had once vowed an eternity together. Max lowered his head, his ears flattening against the rain, every muscle trembling. Was it another cruel trick of the mind? A phantom conjured by the ache of longing? His heart, battered and guarded for so long, thudded painfully against his ribs. Across the square, Ethan's breath hitched. Memories slammed into him, a tiny, clumsy puppy gnawing on his shoelaces, a young dog sleeping pressed against his chest after Sarah's funeral, the night he lost everything, including Max. Ethan dropped to one knee, ignoring the sting of cold water soaking his jeans. He opened his arms wide and did the only thing he could. He whispered into the storm, his voice raw and trembling, "Max. Come home, buddy." Initially, Max did not stir. His paws felt as if they were shackled to the cracked asphalt. Years of pain, hunger, and betrayal from the world screamed at him not to believe. But then, one step, a trembling paw lifted, then another. His nose caught that scent again, and everything else faded away. A broken whimper escaped his throat, more emotion than sound. And before anyone could blink, Max launched across the street. He didn't run, he flew. Rain splashed around him, legs pumping through the puddles, eyes locked onto the only thing that had ever mattered. Ethan braced himself just in time as a soaking wet, half-starved missile of fur and love collided with him, knocking him backward into the mud. Max whimpered, barked, cried, pressing his body against Ethan's chest, pawing desperately, licking his face, his ears, anything he could reach. Ethan clutched Max to him like a man drowning, sobs racking his body as years of guilt, grief, and unbearable loneliness poured out into the storm. People paused under awnings and behind windows, drawn by the scene unfolding before them like a living painting. Some reached for their phones, unable to resist capturing a moment that felt bigger than the town itself. But most just watched, silently, witnessing a reunion stitched together by threads stronger than steel. And through it all, Max never stopped touching Ethan. A paw on his heart, a nose against his cheek, a tail thudding weakly against the ground. He needed Ethan to know, "I'm here. I never gave up. Not once." The rain kept falling, drenching them both, but neither moved to leave. Time itself seemed to pause, honoring the reunion of two broken halves who had somehow, against every odd, found each other again. And in that perfect, imperfect moment, Ethan knew he hadn't just come back to a town. He had come back to life. The subsequent morning, the rain had yielded to a persistent, overcast sky that felt substantial enough to flatten the town. Ethan sat on the floor of a small veterinary clinic, his jeans stained with mud, his hands trembling slightly as he kept them on Max's battered frame. Max leaned into him, his breathing slow but shallow, his eyes half closed from exhaustion. Dr. Emily Hart, the town's sole veterinarian, knelt beside them, her hands gentle but firm as she examined Max. She posed no questions, not yet. Some narratives did not require immediate articulation. They necessitated patience. Max's body was a chronicle of survival inscribed in contusions, scars, and bones that protruded too sharply. An old rib fracture, teeth worn down from gnawing on metal, a nasty scar running across his back leg. Ethan clenched his fists when he saw them, rage and guilt vying for space within his chest. Max had endured battles he couldn't even begin to conceive, all while Ethan had been spiraling in his own private torment. Different conflicts, same desolation. Dr. Hart worked in silence, moving with the quiet proficiency of someone who had witnessed far too much and learned not to recoil. Finally, she spoke, her voice low but kind. "It's a miracle he's still alive, and a greater one that he's still fighting to stay." Max opened one eye at the sound of her voice, gave a tiny thump of his tail against the floor, and closed it again. The message was clear enough. He wasn't going anywhere now that he had Ethan back. Flashbacks swirled like smoke in Ethan's mind. He remembered Max as a pup, terrified of thunderstorms, burrowing under Ethan's arm until the shaking stopped. He remembered the way Max used to chase after Sarah's bicycle, his tail wagging like a metronome, when life still made sense. He remembered the sharp guilt of seeing Max vanish into the woods that awful day, and the sharper choice to leave town without him. Dr. Hart, sensing the silent collapse happening inside Ethan, placed a soft hand on his shoulder. "Some bonds," she said, "survive even when everything else falls apart. Some bonds, they're unbreakable, whether we think we deserve them or not." Ethan nodded, but it felt like something inside him cracked open all the same. Max needed care. Weeks of rest, proper food, gentle handling to undo the years of fear etched into his bones. But more than stitches or bandages, he needed trust rebuilt brick by careful brick. And Ethan knew it would start not with words, but with presence, with being there, with showing up, no matter how broken he still felt himself. As Dr. Hart laid out a recovery plan full of vet visits, medications, and cautious optimism, Ethan barely heard her. He only had eyes for the dog curled beside him, the same dog who had survived storms, hunger, loneliness, and the worst humanity could throw at him, and who had still come running back the first chance he got. And in that moment, Ethan made a vow he had once broken. No matter what came next, Max would never have to face it alone again. Life did not revert to its previous state overnight. Healing seldom occurs with the ease of flipping a switch. It is more akin to piecing together a quilt with unsteady hands, thread by arduous thread. Ethan secured a modest room at a dilapidated motel on the town's periphery, a place where the lights flickered more frequently than they remained consistently lit, and the scent of old carpeting clung to the walls like an unpleasant memory. It was not a home, but it was a sanctuary, a place where Max could finally sleep without shivering from cold or fear, a place where Ethan could desperately attempt to reconstruct some semblance of a life. By day, Ethan undertook part-time employment at a dusty garage situated on the far side of town, the kind of establishment where rust predominated and every patron paid in cash or with begrudging deference. Max, still frail but gradually regaining strength, became a familiar presence. He would nap behind the counter, one eye partially open, his ears twitching at every unfamiliar sound. The regular customers began to recognize the battered shepherd with the haunted eyes. Some even left treats near the cash register without uttering a word, as if acknowledging something sacred they did not fully comprehend. However, trauma has a way of leaving its imprints on the soul. Max flinched at sudden movements, barked low and gutturally when heavy boots approached too closely, and refused to eat if his bowl scraped too loudly across the tile. Nightmares were frequent. Ethan would awaken to Max whimpering in the darkness, his paws twitching, ensnared in battles only he could perceive. And each time, Ethan would slide off the bed, settle onto the cold floor beside him, and wait until Max found his way back to the present. One evening, while acquiring a burger from a grimy roadside eatery, Ethan sensed eyes upon him, not the innocuous curiosity of strangers, but something darker, more oppressive. 3 men lingered by an old van with peeling paint, their laughter sharp and unkind. One of them, a wiry individual with a jagged scar bisecting his eyebrow, locked eyes with Max and sneered. Ethan tightened his grip on the leash instinctively. He did not like the expression on their faces, not curiosity, but recognition. Later, back at the motel, a slip of paper tucked into his doorframe fluttered to the ground. No signature, just 5 ugly words scribbled in a messy scrawl: give him back or pay. Ethan's blood ran cold. This wasn't just paranoia. Max had survived monsters on the streets, monsters who clearly weren't ready to let him go without a fight. Ethan crumpled the paper in his fist and turned to Max, who was watching him silently from the bed, his head tilted as if reading the storm behind his eyes. There was no going back, no safe waiting this one out. Max was more than a dog now, he was the last piece of a shattered world Ethan refused to lose again. The walls of Ethan's motel room felt thinner than paper that night. Every gust of wind rattling the window, every car door slamming outside, sent jolts of adrenaline through him. He sat awake on the edge of the bed, watching Max sleep fitfully on the floor, paws twitching with dreams he couldn't outrun. The crumpled threat notes still sat on the nightstand like a bomb waiting to go off. Ethan didn't need a second warning to know that whoever had left it wasn't bluffing. The town wasn't big, and the kind of people who scribbled threats on scraps of paper didn't usually bother with second chances. There were no easy plays here. Ethan thought about going to the police for half a second, then he remembered how thin resources stretched in a town like this, how hard it was to prove a threat without a face or a name. He thought about running, packing Max up, and disappearing into the night like shadows fleeing a sunrise. But even that wasn't simple. Max was still healing. Long trips meant stress, stress meant setbacks. And deep down, Ethan knew running would only delay the inevitable. Fear doesn't let you hide for long. The truth was brutal: if they wanted Max back, they'd come for him. And this time, Ethan wasn't willing to lose him. Old memories slithered into his mind, uninvited but relentless: Sarah's accident, the helplessness of standing by, unable to change the outcome, the guilt of leaving Max behind once. A deep, ugly voice inside whispered that maybe he wasn't strong enough to protect the ones he loved, that maybe he would always fail when it mattered most. Max stirred at the tension in the room, lifting his head with a soft whine, his eyes locking onto Ethan's. In that look was everything: trust, loyalty, a fierce love forged in fire and frost. Max didn't care about Ethan's scars, seen or unseen. He didn't see failure, he saw family. Ethan exhaled shakily and ran a hand through his hair. No more running. No more being the man who let fear make his decisions. If the fight was coming, he'd be ready this time. As the motel clock ticked toward midnight, Ethan shoved a backpack with essentials, a few cans of dog food, water bottles, a first aid kit, into the back of his beat-up truck. He checked the engine twice, then 3 times. Max watched silently, sensing the shift in energy, his tail thumping once in quiet approval. They would leave before dawn, Ethan decided, get ahead of whatever trouble was circling. Maybe head toward the old state park a few towns over, lay low until they could figure something better out. No grand plan, just survival for now. But fate had other plans. As Ethan loaded the last bag into the truck bed, headlights flared in the darkness behind him. A black van, creeping closer like a shark in shallow water, the same peeling paint, the same growling engine from the burger stand parking lot. Ethan's stomach dropped, ice flooding his veins. This wasn't a warning anymore. This was the beginning. He scooped Max up into the passenger seat with a whispered apology for the rough handling, slammed the door shut, and twisted the ignition. The truck coughed, stuttered, then roared to life just as the van sped toward them. The night split open into chaos. Tires screamed against asphalt. Adrenaline turned seconds into hours. Ethan gritted his teeth, white-knuckling the steering wheel as he wrenched the truck onto the highway. Max braced against the seat, ears pinned back. They weren't just running from a threat anymore, they were running toward a promise, a vow Ethan wasn't going to break again. The highway became a blur under Ethan's tires, twin ribbons of wet asphalt extending endlessly ahead. Rain had begun to fall again, not in a deluge this time, but in a fine, chilling mist that rendered everything slick and spectral. Behind him, the black van maintained its distance, its headlights cutting through the darkness like two burning eyes. Ethan knew this was no longer merely about a dog, this was about survival, about not allowing fear to dictate the conclusion of their story. Max sat rigidly on the passenger seat, pressed against the door, alert despite the exhaustion weighing him down. Every nerve in his body was attuned to Ethan's tension. Even as broken as he was, Max understood. Tonight mattered. Ethan thought quickly. The next exit loomed, leading to a secondary road he recalled from his adolescence, a winding, potholed track through a dense section of woods. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was preferable to being forced off a main thoroughfare where no one would hear their cries. He yanked the wheel, tires screeching as the truck veered off the highway, the old engine groaning in protest. The van followed. Of course, it did. The road narrowed into a rough dirt path, engulfing them in trees so dense they appeared interwoven at their crowns. Ethan's hands clenched the steering wheel tighter. The truck's headlights bounced erratically across the uneven terrain, illuminating broken fences, abandoned agricultural machinery, the skeletal remnants of a forgotten world. He spotted a collapsing barn up ahead and made a split-second decision. He extinguished the headlights, coasted towards it, and maneuvered the truck behind the cover of an old tractor. The van sped past, its taillights disappearing into the trees like two blood-red stars. Ethan held his breath. Max remained motionless. They waited, hearts pounding in the silence, until the world settled around them once more. Inside the barn, they found shelter, if one could call it that. The roof sagged precariously, beams hung like fractured limbs, and the floor was nothing but mud and straw. But it was dry, and more importantly, it was concealed. Ethan guided Max to a corner and settled beside him, his back pressed against the damp wood. For the first time in what felt like hours, Ethan allowed the full weight of the night to crash into him. His chest tightened painfully, fear clawing at the edges of his mind. Had he done enough? Could he truly keep Max safe this time? Or was history merely waiting to repeat itself? Max, sensing the spiral, did what Max always did. He moved closer, pressing his scarred body against Ethan's side, his head dropping heavily onto Ethan's lap, a simple act, but it broke something inside Ethan in the best possible way. Max wasn't afraid. He wasn't doubting. He was trusting completely, recklessly, beautifully. Flashbacks flickered again, not just of pain and loss, but of love, of Sarah laughing as Max chased butterflies in the backyard, of Ethan teaching Max to catch a ball, the two of them collapsing into the grass in fits of joy. Not every memory was a wound, some were reminders of why you fought like hell to hold on to the good. Outside, somewhere in the woods, the van's engine snarled to life again. The hunters weren't giving up. But neither was Ethan. He looked down at Max, scratched behind his ear the way he used to, and whispered, "We're not running anymore, buddy. From now on, we fight. Together." And sometimes that's all it takes, one broken man, one battered dog, and a promise made in the dark to turn survival into something fiercer. Hope. Weeks later, the world presented a different aspect. It was not flawless, life seldom bestows neatly packaged conclusions, but it was undeniably improved. Ethan and Max had left behind the specters of their former town, exchanging rainy nights and perilous escapes for a more tranquil existence nestled in the expansive embrace of a small countryside community 2 towns distant. A place where the air carried the fragrance of fresh grass instead of exhaust fumes, where strangers waved without suspicion, and where second chances were not merely possible but anticipated. Ethan found employment once more, establishing a modest yet robust garage with the assistance of a few benevolent individuals who were unconcerned with his past. Word spread rapidly, the new proprietor might appear unrefined, but he could reconstruct an engine as if composing a symphony. And there was always Max, the silent, devoted guardian who reclined by the office entrance, greeting patrons with a cautious tail wag and those sagacious, world-weary eyes that seemed to perceive a person's very essence. Max was no longer merely surviving, he was living. His limp diminished to a barely perceptible unevenness, and the scars that once proclaimed tragedy now murmured resilience. He roamed the fenced-in fields behind the garage with a liberty he had not experienced in years, his nose buried in the earth, his tail catching every passing zephyr. Children from the neighborhood would occasionally sneak over, offering him treats and laughing when he gently nudged their pockets for more. Max was wary at first. Old wounds do not mend overnight, but with every wag, every cautious nuzzle, he stitched a little more hope back into himself. Ethan felt it, too. At night, he no longer lay awake, enumerating his errors. He sat on the porch with Max at his feet, observing sunsets bleed across the sky. Feeling for the first time in a considerable period that perhaps he was no longer merely existing. He was home. And then came the day Ethan hadn't realized he was awaiting. He visited Sarah's grave. He did not go alone. With Max trotting beside him, head high, they made the quiet drive to the hill overlooking town. Ethan knelt by the simple headstone, his fingers tracing her name. For a long time, he said nothing. Words had failed him when she died, they failed him now. But beside him, Max leaned gently against his side, grounding him, anchoring him to the here and now. Finally, Ethan smiled, a real one, not the cracked, fragile thing he'd worn like armor for years, and whispered, "We're okay now." He kept me alive when I forgot how. It wasn't closure, because some losses never close. It was something better, peace, a knowing that love leaves footprints you can still follow even when the person is gone. In the months that followed, Ethan adopted a second rescue dog, a scrappy little thing with one ear that refused to stand up straight. Max, the seasoned warrior, took the newcomer under his wing with a patience that melted even the toughest old mechanics in town. The three of them built a life out of the wreckage, one muddy paw print and oil-stained handshake at a time. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the fields turned to gold, Ethan watched Max racing across the meadow, the new dog trailing clumsily behind him. Max was a blur of strength and joy, every muscle alive with purpose. Ethan leaned against the fence, arms folded across his chest, a quiet laugh rumbling out of him. He didn't need a big house or a thick bank account, he had everything that mattered. He had survived. They had survived. Together. And as Max paused at the top of the hill, silhouetted against the dying light, Ethan cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted into the wind, "You found your way back to me, Max. And you saved me more than I ever saved you." Because sometimes the greatest rescues aren't the ones we plan, they're the ones where broken hearts find their way home against every odd and remind us that no matter how long the storm lasts, love is always out there, waiting.